Good morning. I'm News Center Maine's Don Kerrigan, filling the shoes of Pat Callahan this morning, joined by our analysts, Republican Phil Harriman, Democrat Betsy Sweet. Thank you guys both for being with us this morning. Lots happening in Washington. The Supreme Court gave a defeat on one issue to President Biden and supported him on another, both related to vaccines, saying you can't mandate businesses to get their people vaccinated, but you can mandate people in healthcare industries get vaccinated. Phil, we'll start with you. What do you think of those two decisions?
I think they were the right ones to force employers to make sure that their employees are vaccinated is beyond, in my view, the constitutional rights, and the court affirmed it. And on the other hand, making sure that people who are coming into an environment for healthcare are not unduly exposed to risks makes, I think, the right decision that the Supreme Court made.
I think the real issue is how do we get this pandemic under control? And we've given voluntary ways to do it, incentives, and we have more people dying, more people in the hospital than ever before. So I think it's really this attempt to try and say, okay, how can we do this? And certainly for healthcare workers, if you go in with a chronic condition and that being exposed to COVID is going to be a problem, having someone who's a likely carrier now these days is really problematic. So it's really, this politicization has made that a decision, and I don't know whether a different court would have done it differently. But I think, I think many businesses are taking this into their own hands. There's many businesses that you can't go in unless you show your proof of vaccinations, restaurants, hotel, and so I think they're taking it to their own hands because they're desperate, not only for our business, but because they're losing workers.
In regard to the court itself, you had two of the conservative justices Roberts and Kavanaugh, being in the majority both times. What does this tell you, if anything, about the court and future decisions? Maybe nothing. I don't know. Betsy?
I don't think this is very indicative of anything. I think that this is such a wacky issue legally that I don't think that tells us anything.
Yeah. Phil?
I look at the Supreme Court as the place where we determine in our society how much power the government has over us. It's inherent in America that all rights vest with we, the people, and we decide how much of those rights and powers to give to the government. And in this case, the Supreme Court, in my view, has ruled appropriately.
Speaking of rights, this huge fight going on in the U.S. Capitol, the Senate, it's been this week, over this voting rights issue. Complete split between Democrats and Republicans. Two Democrats holding out, not willing to change at this point the filibuster law, and apparently not willing to support the voting rights bills. Is anything going to happen on this, Phil, and do you think it should?
Well, I hope it does, but there's two distinct points. One is that the filibuster rule is in place because it's the only place in government, at least in Washington, where the minority has the opportunity to put the majority in check. It doesn't happen in the House of Representatives. It doesn't happen in the Supreme Court. It doesn't happen in the office of the president. It's only in the United States Senate where the minority has more influence. So with that as a given, I think if the Voting Rights Act has flaws that are so egregious that the question is, do we get rid of the filibuster, which I think would be a historic, huge mistake, or do they roll up their sleeves and work, find a way to get 60 votes? That's why it's
but
there.
They don't seem willing to do that.
Well, obviously they aren't. But the point I'm trying to make is that if it's going to get 60 votes, they're going to have to compromise.
Okay, Betsy.
Okay, Phil. I want you to read the bill. I want everyone watching this to read the bill. There is nothing liberal, egregious, wacky out there about getting people to vote. This is the constitutional legal protection for people for the most fundamental thing in our democracy. This last time this bill came up, it passed with 98 senators. There's nothing new in this bill that would change that. This is all about trying to decide who is going to decide the next elections. And they are afraid, they are scared to death, the Republicans, that they're not going to win. So they are resorting to this and to gerrymandering and using the filibuster. Listen, they all just voted a month ago to make a loophole in the filibuster to raise the debt ceiling. Mm-hmm. And right before this, when Trump was president, Susan Collins and Mitch McConnell undid the filibuster so that they could get their Supreme Court nominees in through. So it's baloney to say that this is something, this incredible standard that's never been changed. It's been changed all the time. This is purely political, and we need to see it for that. And it is a very sad day in our democracy. I'm very fearful for our democracy that we can't pass the most fundamental thing, which is making sure people have the right to vote. As we see 30 states, Republican majorities in 30 states have already passed bills to restrict voting rights because they can't control who's going to get elected, so they're going to control who the electors are.
Okay, let's move on. One other federal topic, which is inflation. Phil, this really falls into your wheelhouse, for better or worse. Inflation rate just reported for last year, 7%, unheard of for decades. Is this a blip? Are we going to go back down, or do you think we're stuck with this for a while?
We're stuck with this for a while until the supply chain comes back to normal, and the amount of spending that's going on at the government level, which is creating even more scarcity, comes back to a normal cycle. And I hope our elected officials and our regulators, particularly the Federal Reserve, uses their opportunity to get this back in place.
Businesses saying, "Oh, inflation's up. I'm going to jack up my prices," and we have seen it. Elizabeth Warren called them out yesterday in an incredible hearing, where she talked about, that once they see or hear the word inflation, it's amazing how volatile we are as American people. When we hear something, then we sort of act in that way. And so this has given some free rein to companies. So I agree, we have to rein some stuff back, and the Federal Reserve has to get involved here. But I also think that we have to keep an eye on companies that are just taking advantage of this and sticking it to us.
A lot of talk and buzz in Maine as the COVID pandemic continues to rage across the state. Well over 1,000 new cases reported a day. Omicron has taken firm control, it appears, of everything. Hospitals are really being put to the task, and as we know, there's been approval for hospitals, if they reach a critical staffing point, to use some staffers who have tested positive for COVID to have them still work. And Betsy, I'll start with you. Should people be concerned about this? Were you surprised when you heard about it?
Well, it's the federal CDC, and I think it shows the sad state of affairs of our mental health, of our health system, of our healthcare system. I mean, none of us want that positive person in the emergency rooms or in the hospitals. But what are they going to do? They have no staffing. They don't have enough people. They've got tons of people out with COVID, and then we've got people languishing in the emergency room. People who can't get care, let alone for COVID, but for heart attacks, for all kinds of other things. So I mean, our hands are tied. I'm not sure exactly what else we can do.
But what I think is frustrating the viewers of the Political Brew is the inconsistency of how this virus has been handled. And fortunately, if you have been vaccinated and you get COVID, the severity of your symptoms are proven to be minor, which is great news. And maybe, just maybe, we are at the top of the mountain, so to speak, of this issue. And in the weeks ahead, we'll finally put this behind us.
There was a public hearing this week. The legislature's, of course, waiting to get a supplemental budget proposal from Governor Mills, in particular, how she thinks we ought to use this projected $822 million revenue surplus coming in the next budget year that starts in July. One lawmaker has a bill in that had a public hearing this week to require end of the year surplus, 90% of it, to be given back to taxpayers in some form. Phil, do you think this has any prayer of passing the legislature, and is it a good idea to impose those kind of mandates?
Well, I think there's two parts to what you've asked for. Does it make sense? Yes, I think it does. Those dollars are taken out of the private sector and put into the government sector, $800 and something million that they didn't budget for, didn't plan on. It should go back to the taxpayers. They need it, particularly as we talked earlier in Political Brew about the raging inflation that we're experiencing. Give people back their money. On the other hand, I think it's how they give it back. Do they lower rates, or is it just a one-time check from the governor in an election year? And then finally, to specifically answer your question, I think this bill's got a long, tough road with Democrats in the majority party in the House, the Senate, and the governor's office.
Yeah.
And part of that money, Phil, is because they got pandemic assistance. So it's not all just their hard-earned money. And I think, of course, we want to get it in the hands of people. But when we just talked about the huge problem that we're having in hospitals, the mental health pandemic that none of us are talking about with suicides and opioid rates, people who can't go back to work because they don't have childcare. I mean, there are and back to what I just said, there are needs that we have collectively, and those need to be taken care of first. And then when they're given back, I agree with Phil that we have to look about how we do that. Sending a check to people who make $1 million as well as people who are making $10,000, that doesn't make any sense to me at all.
There's lots of talk about, gee, we need to put more money into childcare, affordable housing. You just mentioned mental health. Well, if you can only put it in a couple of places, where does it go? Betsy, I'll start with you since you were just on that.
Yeah. So to me, I think the two glaring huge problems that we have right now are mental health. And then the other issue is housing. Those are the two huge issues that we have. We have put some money into childcare last year, put some money into direct care workers last year, but I think that mental health and housing have not gotten the attention that they need. And I think that, to me, is where we need to go.
Well, I don't disagree with the priorities. I would just say that even back in my time in the Maine Senate, when I first started working with Betsy, we were talking about the same things. 20 years later, we're still talking about housing and mental health issues. And I don't know of a better time with all of this money that came out of Washington to Maine that those two items weren't exactly where the dollars went. They didn't. We're still talking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
So if somebody says, let's take that $822 million, let's put a chunk of it into each of those things. Should that happen, Phil?
Well, yes, some of it could and should, but it should be at creating affordable housing. We have a Maine State Housing Authority that's been in place for decades. That's their mission. We're still talking about unaffordable housing. We got to reprioritize how we spend money in the state of Maine. 80% of every tax dollar paid goes to two places: education and health and human services, and it isn't enough.
Yeah. All right. Winners and losers. Betsy, you first.
So my loser is Senator Susan Collins, who says she's supporting of the Voting Rights Act, but will not do anything about the filibuster to make it happen. So she's my loser for the week. And the winner is, in honor of Martin Luther King Day, all of the people in the state, in this country, who are carrying on the legacy of Martin Luther King by fighting for justice, racial justice, addressing systemic bias, making sure we don't have mass incarceration, looking at peace and justice issues. And there are thousands and thousands of them in Maine. And I just they are my winners, and I appreciate you. And I am so grateful for the work that you do every day.
Thank you, Phil.
Well, I want to echo Betsy's winner of the week. Outstanding choice. My loser of the week is President Biden, who campaigned on get rid of Trump, elect me, and I will get rid of this virus. He acknowledged this week that there isn't a federal solution to the virus. My winner of the week is the U.S. Supreme Court for deciding that the regulatory arm of the executive branch of government does not have the constitutional right to tell employers to get their employees vaccinated.
All right. Thank you both very much. A lot happening, and we'll be following it all during the coming week. Thanks for joining us. News Center Maine continues right after this.